The men at the store heard about it from a freighter who had slowed his wagon on the road north of town. A widow, he said, was digging a ditch around her cabin, not a drainage cut, not a foundation trench. A ring, 6 feet from the walls, all the way around, deep enough that she stood in it up to her chest. Her 9-year-old was hauling the dirt in a grain sack. The storekeeper set down his pencil. A moat, he said. He let the word sit. Maybe she thinks poverty comes on horseback. On the claim, half a mile from the laughter, the woman heard none of it. She swung the mattock. The frozen ground broke. She threw the piece aside and swung again. 12 days before the deputy arrived, Burnt Brecka had been hauling cottonwood from Lake Thompson when the rear axle of his borrowed wagon snapped under the weight. The log pile shifted. One trunk caught him across the ribs and pinned him against the wagon bed. He lived long enough for the neighbor who found him to carry him back to the claim cabin, and he died on the floor planks he had not yet finished nailing down, with Ragna pressing a folded shirt against the place where his breathing made a sound like tearing cloth. Eli stood at the foot of the bed holding his sister's hand. Torbjörg did not cry because she did not understand what the sound meant. Eli did, and he cried enough for both of them. That was how Ragna Brecka became a widow, a homestead claimant, and the sole provider for 2 children on 160 acres of open Dakota prairie 6 miles north of De Smet, Kingsbury County, in the autumn of 1880. She was 29 years old. She had $9.30 in a tin behind the flour sack. She had 1 3/4 cords of mixed willow and cottonwood stacked against the east wall of a cabin that measured 16 by 20 feet and lacked storm shutters, a raised floor, and half its chinking. She had 4 sacks of oats, 1 sack of flour, a stove with a cracked door hinge, and a cow that gave less milk each week as the grass turned brown. She had no relatives closer than a cousin in Faribault, Minnesota, and the railroad fare to reach him cost more than everything in her tin combined. She could not leave. The Homestead Act allowed a widow who was head of household to continue her husband's claim, but only if she stayed and improved the land. Walk away, and the quarter section reverted. The claim was the only asset her children would ever inherit from their father. It was not a choice between staying and going. It was a choice between staying and having nothing at all. The cabin told the story of a life interrupted. Burnt had framed the walls and set the ridgepole before the first frost of September. He had nailed planks across the floor joists, but left gaps where the boards did not meet flush. He had chinked the south and west walls with moss and clay, but run out of material on the north side, where the wind hit hardest. The door hung on leather hinges. The single window was oiled paper, not glass. The stovepipe fit its hole in the roof, but the hole had no flashing, and when rain came it hissed on the iron and pooled on the floor near the north wall. Ragna knew all of this. She did not need Milton Ash to tell her, but Milton Ash came anyway. He arrived on the 4th day after Burnt's burial, riding a gray mare with a carpenter's square strapped to his saddlebag. Milton was 57, a former Army wagon master who had built supply sheds from Fort Laramie to the Yellowstone Road and settled near De Smet because he said he was tired of building things that got burned. The town respected him because he could look at a cabin and tell you whether it would stand through February or collapse in March, and he was usually right. He did not knock. He walked the perimeter of the cabin first, pressing his palm flat against each wall in turn the way a doctor touches a patient's chest. He crouched near the north sill and held his hand at ground level. Then he stood, wiped his palm on his coat, and pushed the door open without greeting. Ragna was feeding the stove. Eli was sweeping. Torbjörg sat on the bed with her knees drawn up, watching the stranger with the wariness of a child who had recently learned that adults could stop moving forever. Milton stamped one boot on the plank floor. Hard. The board shuddered and a thin draft lifted through the gap nearest his heel, carrying a breath of cold that smelled like frozen soil. He pulled a strip of moss, chinking from the north wall seam, with 2 fingers. It came away in a clump the size of a fist. He held it up, looked at it, and let it drop. "You do not have a house," Milton said. "You have a box the wind has already found." Ragna set the poker against the stove. "I know what I have." "Do you know what you need?" Milton asked. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a man says something to a woman he expects will not understand the answer. 6 cords minimum, tight chinking on all 4 walls, a raised plank floor with no gaps wider than a knife blade, storm shutters on that window before the first hard blow, a new hinge on that stove door before you lose draft control and smoke yourself out. "How much would 6 cords cost, cut and hauled?" Ragna asked. Milton looked at her. Most widows, he advised, cried or went silent. This one was doing arithmetic. $12 a cord by first snow," he said. "If you can find anyone with a team to spare, which you cannot, because every man within 20 miles is cutting his own wood and running behind. $72 for wood alone. Ragna had $9.30. She needed nails, glass, hinges, chinking material, lamp oil, flour before the sack ran out, salt, medicine if the children fell sick. The numbers did not add. They did not come close to adding, and the weather would not wait for her to find a solution. October was half gone. The grass was dead. The creek ran low. Every dawn arrived colder and shorter than the one before. Milton walked to the door. He paused with one hand on the frame. "Sell the claim," he said. "Take whatever Vail offers and get your children to Minnesota before the ground freezes hard enough to make a grave difficult." "The ground already is," Ragna said. She had buried burnt in soil she had to chop with a mattock because frost had sealed the first 4 inches. Milton looked at the floor, then at the children, then at the gap in the north wall where his fingers had pulled the chinking free. He shook his head and left. The draft he let in when he opened the door took 4 minutes to stop. Ragna did not sell. She did not ride to town. She stood in the doorway after Milton's mare disappeared into the grass and looked at the cabin the way he had looked at it, like a patient whose chances were poor. But she saw something Milton had not mentioned, because Milton was thinking about walls and wood, and she was thinking about the floor. The floorboards moved with the wind, not visibly, not the way a branch moves, but when the north gusts hit, the gaps between planks exhaled cold air upward in thin streams that she could feel on her ankles. The stove heated the air at chest height, and the warm air rose to the ceiling and pressed against the roof, and the cold air slid in below like water filling a ditch. It was not a house losing heat through bad walls. It was a house where the floor was a sieve and the ground beneath it was a highway for cold air that never stopped moving. She did not say this to anyone. She was not sure she was right. But she kept her hand on the floor that night after the fire burned low, and what she felt was not stillness. It was movement, a river of cold running beneath her children while they slept. The question was not how to make more heat. She did not have the wood to make more heat. The question was why the heat she made disappeared so fast and whether the answer was under the floor. She did not know yet what to do about it, but she knew Milton Ash was solving the wrong problem. Orson Vail kept his store on the main road into De Smet, a frame building with a plank counter, a potbelly stove, and a ledger book he guarded like a family Bible. He was 46, lean, patient, and possessed of a talent that made him dangerous on the frontier. He could calculate the distance between a person's debt and their breaking point, and he could wait exactly that long before making his offer. Vail held Ragna's debt note. Burnt had run a tab through the summer. nails, rope, window paper, 2 sacks of oats, a tin of axle grease, lamp oil. The total came to $14.60. On a homestead that earned nothing until the first crop, $14 might as well have been $1,400. When Ragna came to the store 3 days after Milton's visit, she bought only lamp wick and salt. She counted coins onto the counter one at a time. Vale watched her fingers. He opened his ledger, found the briquet page, and made a mark with a red pencil. Not a word. Just the pencil moving where she could see it. After she left, Marit Lunde came in for sugar. Marit was 33, a farm wife with 4 children, and a husband who managed to be both hard-working and perpetually behind. She was not unkind, but she was practical the way people are practical when kindness costs more than they can afford. Vale said, "Mrs. Brecka will sell before Christmas." Marit did not answer immediately. She measured sugar into her sack, tied it, and put her coins down. Then she said, "She might last if she takes washing or sells the cow." "She will not sell the cow," Vale said. "She does not sell things. She holds them until they die." The line was cruel, and he knew it. It traveled. Within a week, 3 women in town had repeated it. It became shorthand for Ragna's stubbornness, which was the word they used because determination sounded too much like praise. Marit visited Ragna the following day. She brought a jar of pickled beets and advice wrapped in genuine concern. "You cannot build winter alone," Marit said. She was standing in the cabin doorway, looking at the gaps in the north wall, the stove with its cracked hinge, the 2 children wearing every piece of clothing they owned indoors. "I am not building winter," Ragna said. "I am building a way through it." Marit set the beets on the table. "Take washing, move into town, board with the Hendersons until spring. Come back when you can afford help. If I leave the claim, I lose it. You can file again. Not this land, not Burnt's land." Marit looked at her the way Milton had, with the expression of someone watching a person make a decision they will not survive. She left the beets and went home. That night, Ragna sat on the floor near the north wall. The stove ticked and cooled. She held a piece of thread tied to a splinter of wood and extended it toward the gap between 2 floorboards. When a gust hit the cabin outside, the thread jerked inward. Not gently, it snapped toward her hand as if pulled by invisible fingers. She moved it to the next gap. The same pull, the next, the same. Cold air was not leaking through the floor. It was being drawn through the floor. The wind outside created pressure that forced air into the cabin at its lowest point, and the warm air rising from the stove created suction that pulled it higher. The floor was not a passive surface. It was the inlet of a system that pumped cold air into her home as long as the wind blew. Rania set 2 cups of water on different surfaces, one on the table, one on the floor near the north sill, 6 inches above the boards. She went to sleep. In the morning, the floor cup had a skin of ice across its surface. The table cup was cold but liquid. The difference was less than 4 feet of height, but it was the difference between frozen and not frozen. She thought about her father, not with grief, with the particular clarity that comes when a memory stops being nostalgia and becomes instruction. In the village outside Bergen, her father had taken her into the root cellar one winter and pressed her palm flat against the stone wall at shoulder height. The stone was cool. Then he guided her hand lower toward the floor, each inch colder. Near the ground, the wall was damp and her fingers ached within seconds. "Kalt Luftsinker," he said. Cold air sinks. It was not a lesson he was teaching. It was a fact he assumed she already understood, the way you assume a child understands that water runs downhill. But he showed her one more thing. He opened the cellar door a crack and held a candle flame near the bottom edge. The flame bent inward toward the cellar, pulled by the cold, dense air draining out along the floor. At the top of the door, the flame leaned outward, pushed by the warm air rising and escaping. The cellar breathed. It inhaled cold at the bottom and exhaled warm at the top. Her cabin did the same thing, except the cabin had no stone walls to hold the warmth, and the cold entered not through a door crack, but through every gap in a floor that was more gap than floor. The answer was not to seal the gaps. She could not afford lumber for a new floor. The answer was not to burn more wood. She could not afford more wood. The answer, and she spent 2 days walking the property, crouching beside walls, lying flat on frozen grass to feel the air moving at ground level before she was sure, was to give the cold air somewhere to go before it reached the floor. A trench, not a wall, not a berm, not sod banked against the sills, which Milton Ash would have prescribed and which would have helped the walls but done nothing for the air moving below the cabin. A continuous trench encircling the cabin at a distance of 6 feet from the walls, deep enough to catch cold air draining along the ground surface before it slid under the sill and rose through the floorboards. Cold air was dense. It ran low. If there was a lower channel for it to follow, it would take the channel instead of sliding under her house. She scratched the dimensions with a stick on frozen ground, 6 feet out from each wall, 5 feet deep where the soil allowed, 4 feet wide at the top, narrowing to 2.5 feet at the bottom so the sides would not collapse. The center line of the trench would run approximately 120 feet around the cabin. She calculated the volume of soil to be removed, roughly 70 cubic yards. She calculated how long it would take one woman with a mattock, a spade, and 2 hours of daylight fading each week. She could not finish before winter. The math was as impossible as Milton's wood math, just arranged differently. But the trench would not cost $12 a cord. It would cost labor. And labor was the one thing Ragna could still give, even if it killed her. She did not tell Marit. She did not tell Milton. She went to the shed where Bernd had kept his tools, found the mattock with the cracked handle he had been meaning to replace, and she carried it to the north wall of the cabin, where the cold entered first and worst. She swung. The frozen topsoil resisted for 3 strokes and then broke. Dark earth appeared beneath the frost line. She smelled roots and clay and something mineral that reminded her of the cellar in Norway. She swung again. The mockery started on the 3rd day. Ragna had cut 18 feet of trench along the north wall, working from dawn until her shoulders seized. The cut was ragged, too steep on the outer edge, and only 2 feet deep, far short of the 5 she needed. But it was visible from the road, and the road carried traffic. A man named Collis Pratt drove his team past the Brecka claim on his way to the mill and slowed his wagon. He watched Ragna standing waist-deep in a gash in the prairie, throwing shovelfuls of black earth onto a growing pile, while her 9-year-old son hauled loose sod in a grain sack. Pratt did not stop, but he mentioned it at Vale's store that afternoon, and by evening the story had a shape. "The Brecka widow is digging a ditch around her cabin," Pratt said. 6 feet out, all the way around. Looked like she means to ring the whole thing. The men at the stove exchanged looks. Vale set down his pencil. "A moat," Vale said. He let the word sit. Then he smiled the way a man smiles when the outcome he predicted begins to arrive ahead of schedule. "Mrs. Brecka is digging herself a moat. Maybe she thinks poverty comes on horseback." The laughter was not cruel in the way that a single cruel person is cruel. It was the laughter of a group that has found a shared absurdity, something they can all agree is foolish, and the agreement itself feels like warmth. Within 2 days, children at the schoolhouse repeated "dry moat" when Eli passed. A woman at the well asked Marit whether the Norwegian widow planned to fill her moat with water and stock it with fish. Marit did not laugh, but she did not defend Ragna either. She went to the Brekke claim on the 5th day with a pot of bean soup and stood at the edge of the trench watching Ragna work. "What is this for?" Marit asked. Ragna kept digging. "The cold runs along the ground. If there is a lower place for it to go, it will not go under the cabin." Marit looked at the trench. She looked at Ragna's hands, which were blistered across both palms and bleeding at the base of the right thumb. She looked at the pile of spoil earth, the small figure of Eli dragging sod, and the cabin beyond, still missing chinking on the north wall, still without shutters, still everything Milton Ash had said it was. "You will spend October digging a grave around your own house," Marit said. "Maybe," Ragna said, "but the house will be warmer." "You do not know that." "No, but I know what happens if I do nothing." Marit left the soup and walked home. She told her husband that the Brekke widow had lost her mind. Her husband said nothing because he was already behind on his own firewood and did not have attention to spare for a neighbor's madness. Vale rode out to the Brekke claim on the 7th day. He brought Milton Ash and Marit Lund, an arrangement that was not accidental. He wanted witnesses when he made his offer, and he wanted the town's most respected builder and its most practical woman to confirm that what Ragna was doing was irrational. They stood at the edge of the trench. It now ran 41 feet along the north wall and turned the corner toward the west side. The depth varied from 18 inches to 3 feet. The sides were uneven. A pile of dark earth sat where the garden should have been. Milton walked the length of the cut. He tapped the bank with the toe of his boot and watched a clod break free and tumble to the bottom. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Ragna. "I told you what your cabin needs," Milton said. "Chinking, wood, shutters, a new floor. Those are the things that keep a house warm in Dakota winter, not a ditch." "The ditch is not for warmth," Ragna said. "It is to stop the cold from entering at the floor." "That's the same thing." "No, it is not." Milton looked at her the way school teachers look at a student who has given an answer that is not quite wrong, but not quite right either, and who does not have the training to know the difference. Wind comes through gaps. You seal the gaps. That is building. What you are doing is earthwork, and earthwork is for drainage and foundations, not for heat. "The wind comes under the sill and through the floor," Ragna said. "Cold air runs low. If I give it a lower road, it will take it." Vale stepped forward. He had been waiting for this moment. "Mrs. Brekke," he said. His voice was patient, the voice of a man offering charity. "I have your account at $14.60. Your husband owed it, and it passes to you. I am not pressing you today, but winter is coming, and you're standing in a hole." He let that land. "I will offer you $18 for the claim and cancellation of the debt. You take your children and your cow to Minnesota. You start fresh somewhere the weather does not require a moat." "The claim is not for sale," Ragna said. "Everything is for sale when January comes," Vale said. "Ask Milton." Milton said nothing. He did not agree with Vale's methods, but he also did not disagree with his conclusion. The cabin was not ready. The widow was digging a ditch instead of cutting wood. The children wore every stitch they owned, and the eldest had a cough that came and went, like a draft through a bad wall. Vale shrugged. He turned his horse toward the road. Over his shoulder, he said, "The wind does not fall into holes because you ask politely, Mrs. Brekke." Ragna watched them go. Then she picked up the mattock, stepped back into the trench, and swung. Eli sat on the spoiled pile with his arms wrapped around his knees. He had heard everything. After a while, he picked up the grain sack and began hauling sod again. He did not ask his mother if they were going to be all right. He had learned in the 12 days since his father died that some questions had no answer, and asking them made everything heavier. By the end of the first week, Ragna had completed 41 feet of trench at varying depths. By the end of the second week, she had extended the cut to 63 feet and turned both corners of the north wall. The depth on the oldest sections reached 3.5 feet. Her back seized every morning. She soaked her hands in warm water before dawn and wrapped them in strips torn from Burnt's old shirt. The blisters hardened into calluses that split and bled and hardened again. She kept a count scratched on the cabin door frame, feet cut, depth reached, days remaining. The numbers moved in the wrong direction. 63 feet done, 57 to go, 3.5 feet deep where she needed 5. October waning, first hard frost already passed. The willow and cottonwood she had burned through the first 2 weeks reduced her cord count to 1.5. 6 weeks to deep winter, half the trench unfinished. On the 9th day, she swung the mattock into a section of clay-heavy soil near the west wall, and the handle cracked at the base of the head. The split ran 8 inches down the shaft. She bound it with wire and kept working, but the wobble in the swing cost her power and accuracy, and by the end of that day she had cut only 4 feet instead of her usual 6 to 8. Torbjörg's cough appeared on the 11th day. A dry bark at night that woke Ragna from the 2 hours of sleep she allowed herself. She boiled water with dried chamomile from a pouch Marit had left and held the child over the steam. The cough did not worsen, but it did not stop. It sat in the back of Ragna's mind like a second clock, counting something she could not afford to measure. Eli carried sod. He did not complain. He organized the spoil pile by size, kept the grain sack patched, and once, when Ragna was too deep in the trench to see the road, he warned her that a rider was coming in time for her to climb out and brush the dirt from her skirt. It was not vanity. It was the understanding, shared between them without words, that a woman seen waist-deep in a muddy ditch would be judged differently than a woman standing beside a construction site. On the 14th day, the first real setback arrived. A wet snow fell overnight, not heavy, but dense enough to soak the exposed earth. The north wall section, where Ragna had cut the sides too steep in her early, angry work, collapsed inward. 3 feet of finished trench filled with a slurry of mud and ice. 8 hours of labor erased by gravity and water. Ragna stood at the edge and looked at the cave-in. Her mattock handle was cracked. Her wood was dwindling. Her child was coughing. The town thought she was insane. And now the earth itself was refusing to hold the shape she had given it. She did not cry. She had stopped crying on the day she buried Bernd. Not because the grief ended, but because tears cost time, and time was the one currency she was spending faster than any other. She was still standing at the edge of the collapsed section when a mule cart appeared on the road from the east. The cart was stacked with salvaged sod, heavy squares of prairie grass cut root deep and piled like dark bricks. The man driving wore a coat patched with flour sacking and a hat that had been rained on so many times it held no particular shape. He was 62 years old, and his breath came in shallow pulls that sounded like paper tearing, because 20 years of lime dust from canal ditching had scarred his lungs into something that worked, but never well. Tolif Assen did not stop because he pitied Ragna Breka. He stopped because he saw the trench. He climbed down from the cart with the careful movements of a man whose body had been used hard and now demanded negotiation for every effort. He walked to the collapsed section and stood where Ragna stood. He looked at the cave-in, then at the intact sections on either side, then at the string line she had staked to guide her cuts, then at the drainage slope she had carved into the trench bottom, 1 inch per 10 feet, running toward the southeast corner where she had begun to dig a sump pit. He crouched. He crumbled a handful of the collapsed bank between his fingers. He rubbed the soil and let it fall. "You cut straight down because you are angry," Tollef said. His accent was Norwegian, thicker than Ragna's, shaped by a childhood in a fjord village and decades of English spoken mostly with other immigrants. "Earth does not hold anger, it holds what slopes." Ragna looked at him. He was a stranger. He was standing at the edge of her failed trench, holding her ruined soil, telling her what she had done wrong. "I know the sides need to slope," she said. "I ran out of time." Tollef looked at the string line again. He looked at the sump pit. He stood, slowly, one hand on his knee. "You know drainage," he said. It was not a question. It was the first thing he had noticed, not the collapse, not the desperation, but the fact that the sump pit existed at all and the slope ran in the right direction. "Who taught you?" "My father kept a root cellar. I watched where water went." Tollef nodded. He walked the full length of the finished trench, his boots leaving prints in the wet earth along the edge. He reached the corner, turned, and walked back. Then he looked at Ragna with the expression of a man who has found something unexpected and is deciding whether it is worth the cost of involvement. "I dug canals in wet clay for the railroad," he said. 15 years. Any cut deeper than 3 feet with straight walls in this soil will fail before the first freeze-thaw cycle. You must batter the banks." He did not ask if she wanted help. He knelt beside the collapsed section and began scooping wet earth with his hands, clearing the debris to expose the base of the cut, where the bottom slope was still intact beneath the slurry. "Cut from here," he said, indicating a point halfway up the bank. "Slope the face at 1 hand's width back for every 2 hands' depth. Freeze pushes straight walls outward. A slope lets ice expand without shearing the face." Ragna picked up her spade. Tollef shook his head. "Not yet. First you recut this section until it holds. I will show you once. Then you will do the next 3 feet while I watch. If the angle is wrong, I will tell you. If it is right, I will eat whatever you are cooking and leave before dark." He did not leave before dark. The recut took 2 hours because the wet soil was heavy, and Ragna's arms trembled with fatigue by the 4th pass. Tollef corrected her angle twice, both times by placing his own hand against the bank face and showing her where the slope broke from true. The 3rd time, she got it right without correction. He ate beans and cornbread at her table. He brought his own beans from the cart, and he did not comment on the size of the portions, or the crack in the stove door, or the child coughing in the corner. He told Eli that canals in wet clay failed when men believed straight lines more than soil. Eli listened with the intensity of a boy who had spent 2 weeks watching his mother fight the earth alone and now saw, for the first time, someone who understood what she was fighting. Tollef stayed the night in his cart. In the morning, he taught Ragna the second skill, sod pinning. Where the trench bank showed loose, sandy soil that would not hold even with a proper slope, he cut strips of prairie sod from the spoil pile, turned them root side out, and pressed them into the weak spot like bandages on a wound. The roots gripped the loose soil and held it, not permanently, but long enough to survive a season of freeze and thaw. "This is what we did when the canal walls wept," Tollef said. "Sod is not stone, but it is alive, and alive things hold." The 3rd lesson came in the afternoon. Tollef walked to the sump pit and poured water from a tin cup onto the trench bottom. They watched it run. It moved toward the sump, but slowly. and it pooled in two low spots where the grade was not consistent. A cold sink that becomes a water trough will rot your sill stones, Tollef said. The trench catches cold air, good, but in spring it will catch snowmelt. If the water sits, your foundation soaks, your floor swells. By next winter, the cure is worse than the disease. He showed her how to test the slope by pouring water every 10 feet and watching for hesitation. Where the grade dipped, she dug a shallow relief, an inch deeper, 4 inches wide, to carry water through the low spot to the sump. He showed her how to read the sump's capacity by filling it with a bucket and timing how long the water took to seep into the subsoil. If it holds overnight, you need a deeper pit or an overflow channel, he said. If it drains within an hour, the soil is doing the work. By the end of the second day, Tollef had eaten at Ragna's table twice, taught her 3 techniques through demonstration, and spoken more words to Eli than any adult man had spoken to the boy since Bernd died. He had not once offered pity, suggested she sell, or said the word impossible. He hitched his mule on the morning of the 3rd day. His cough was bad, a deep wet rattle that came from a place in his chest where the lime dust had settled years ago and never left. Ragna stood at the cart while he tied his sod load. "Will you come back?" she asked. Tollef looked at the trench, 41 feet of properly sloped bank, 22 feet of original rough cut that needed reworking, 57 feet not yet begun. He did the math the way she did, not with hope, but with distance and time and the weight of soil. "I have sawed to deliver north of town," he said. 3 days, maybe 4. Then I have nowhere particular to be. It was not a promise. It was a door left open, which was all either of them could afford. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could see the work but not the reason behind it? Ragna watched the cart disappear east. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and heavy, pressing down on the prairie like a hand testing the weight of something it intended to crush. She turned back to the trench. 57 feet to go, maybe 4 feet deep on the best sections. Weeks of work ahead, and the calendar did not care about her progress. She picked up the mattock with the cracked handle, stepped into the trench, and swung. The earth broke. She threw the piece aside. She swung again. Somewhere behind her, Torbjörg coughed. Tollef came back on the 4th day, not the 3rd. His cough had kept him in the borrowed barn north of town for an extra night, and when he arrived at the break-a-claim, his face was the color of cold ash, and his hands shook on the mule's reins. He did not mention the cough. He climbed down from the cart, walked to the trench, and looked at what Ragna had done since he left. She had extended the cut 9 feet along the west wall. The slope was correct. The sod pins held on the sandy section near the corner. The sump pit had been deepened by 8 inches and lined with flat stones she had pried from the creek bed, carrying them 2 at a time in a flour sack across 400 yards of dead grass. Tollef said nothing for a long time. He walked the new section, crouched at the corner where north met west, and tested the bank angle with his palm. Then he stood and looked at Ragna, who was watching him from the trench with the mattock resting across her shoulder and her breath making clouds in the morning air. "You learn fast," he said. "That is dangerous." "Why dangerous?" "Because fast learners believe they are finished learning before they are." He stayed, not as charity and not as pity. He stayed because the trench interested him. 20 years of canal work had taught him what water did to soil, and Ragna's trench was a canal in reverse, not carrying water, but catching air. The problem was the same: how to make the earth hold a shape it did not want to hold through a season that would try to destroy it. They worked in parallel. Ragna cut new trench along the west wall, while Tolef reworked the original north wall sections, deepening them from 3.5 feet to the full 5, and correcting the slope on the earliest, angriest cuts. He worked slowly because his lungs allowed nothing else, but his cuts were precise, and his banks held without reinforcement. He could read soil the way some men read weather, by color, by texture, by the sound the spade made when it struck. Progress became measurable. Day 18, 74 feet complete at proper depth and slope. Day 21, 82 feet. Day 24, 91 feet with both long walls finished and the east end begun. Ragna kept the count on the door frame, and Eli updated it each evening with a pencil stub, adding the date and the temperature he read from Bernt's old mercury thermometer hung on a nail beside the stove. But the calendar fought them. The days shortened. Dawn arrived later each morning, and dark pressed in by 5 o'clock. The temperature dropped in steps. A warm day, then 2 cold ones, then a warm day, then 3 cold ones. The pattern ratcheted downward. By the 3rd week of October, the topsoil froze overnight and did not thaw until mid-morning, costing Ragna 2 hours of cutting time each day. The deeper soil remained workable, but only if she started at the bottom of an existing section and worked upward into the frozen crust, which required twice the effort and produced half the result. Tolef taught as he worked. He did not lecture. He demonstrated, then watched, then corrected, then said nothing when correction was no longer needed. He showed Ragna how to read soil layers by color. Dark topsoil held roots and sheared in blocks. Yellow clay beneath it was dense and held angles well but cracked when frozen. Gray silt below the clay drained water poorly and needed extra sump depth. Each layer required a different spade angle and a different expectation. He told Eli that the worst canal he ever dug ran through blue clay outside Fargo. The foreman wanted straight walls. Tolef wanted battered walls. The foreman won. 3 weeks later, a spring rain filled the canal, and the straight walls caved like paper. 12 men spent 4 days redigging what Tolef had told them would fail. The foreman never apologized. He never had to. The mud apologized for him. Eli listened to every word. He began testing bank angles with a stick the way Tolef tested them with his hand, pressing the flat side against the slope and checking whether light showed between stick and soil. When it did, the angle was too steep. When it did not, the bank was holding. The setbacks continued in sequence. On day 19, Vale refused Ragna credit for lamp oil. She had come to the store with 35 cents and a request for a quarter gallon, which cost 20 cents. Vale said her account was frozen until the note was addressed. It was not true. Her cash purchases were separate from the credit note. But Vale controlled the only store within riding distance, and who would she complain to? Ragna bought a tallow candle from Marit for 4 cents, and worked the last hour of daylight by candlelight wedged into a crack in the trench wall, the flame guttering every time the wind found the cut. On day 22, a neighbor's stray cow walked along the edge of the trench on the north side, where the spoil apron was soft and uneven, and fell in. The cow was not injured, but it took Ragna, Eli, and Tolef an hour to rig a rope harness and walk the animal out through the shallow east end where the cut was not yet at full depth. The neighbor, a man named Decatur Shields, retrieved his cow without thanks and told the story at Vale's store as comedy. By evening, the moat had a new chapter. The Brecka widow was trapping livestock. Ragna built 2 narrow plank crossings from boards Tolef had salvaged from an abandoned pig shelter. She marked the trench edges with willow stakes driven into the spoil at 10-foot intervals, each stake wrapped at the top with a strip of torn cloth so it was visible in poor light. The crossings were practical. The stakes were a concession to a world that would use any mistake as proof of madness. On day 26, Torbjörn's cough returned. Not the dry bark from before. A deeper sound, a rattle that came from the child's chest when she breathed at night. Ragna boiled willow bark tea and held the girl against her chest while the steam rose. She did not sleep. In the morning, the cough was quieter, but Ragna's hand shook as she picked up the mattock, and she could not tell whether the shaking was exhaustion or fear. Tollef saw the shaking. He did not mention it. He took the mattock from her and cut the first section of the day while she sat on the spoil pile with Torbjörn in her lap and Eli banking the stove. It was the only morning she did not start with the first swing. Milton Ash returned on day 28. He had not visited since the confrontation with Vale. He rode his gray mare to the edge of the trench and sat in the saddle for a full minute, looking at what 2.5 weeks of labor had produced. The trench now ran 91 feet around 3 sides of the cabin. The banks were sloped and clean. The sod pins held on the weak sections. The sump pit was lined and draining. The willow stakes stood like sentries along the rim. Milton dismounted and walked the perimeter. He stopped at the corner where Tollef had reworked the original north wall collapse. He knelt and pressed his carpenter's square against the bank angle. The slope was consistent within a 1/4 inch across 4 feet of face. He stood up and looked at Tollef. "You did the finish work," Milton said. "She did the finish work," Tollef said. "I did the first 3 feet. She did the correction." Milton looked at Ragna. He looked at the trench. He said, "It is a neat foolishness, but it is foolishness all the same." He remounted and rode toward town. Tollef watched him go and said nothing. Ragna drove a willow stake into the east bank and wrapped the top with a strip of blue cloth from Eli's outgrown shirt. The trench was not finished. 29 feet remained on the east wall, the shallowest and last section. The soil there was sandier and required more sod pinning. Tollef's cough worsened each evening, and he slept sitting upright in the cart because lying flat made the rattle in his chest sound like something drowning. Ragna's right shoulder ached from the mattock swing. A deep, grinding pain that ran from the socket to the base of her neck and did not ease with rest because she never rested long enough for easing. But the trench grew. Foot by foot, stake by stake, it enclosed the cabin in a ring of open earth that looked, from the road, exactly like what Vale had called it, a dry moat for a queen with no kingdom. Ragna drove the last willow stake on the 10th of November. 122 feet of continuous trench, 5 feet deep at the shallowest stable section, 5.5 at the deepest, 4 feet wide at the top, narrowing to 2.5 at the bottom. The banks were battered at consistent angles. The sod pins held on 11 weak sections. The sump pit at the southeast corner drained within 2 hours after a poor test. 2 plank crossings bridged the east and south sides. Willow stakes marked every 10 feet. Tollef stood at the south crossing and looked at the completed ring. His breathing was shallow and fast, the way it always was now, but his face showed something that might have been satisfaction if he were the kind of man who allowed himself satisfaction. "Now we see," he said. Ragna had already begun measuring. She had 3 thermometers, 1 mercury tube hung near the stove, 1 at table height on the west wall, and 1 placed 6 inches above the floor near the north sill, propped in a tin cup so it would not roll. The placement was deliberate. If the trench worked, the difference would show first at the floor, where cold air had entered fastest before the cut. She recorded results on the back of Bernt's account ledger with the pencil stub Eli used for his door frame count. The first entry, November 11th, clear night, no wind, stove banked at 9 o'clock. Floor thermometer, 34 degrees. Table thermometer, 41 degrees. Stove side, 52 degrees. Before the trench, on a comparable night, The floor thermometer had dropped below freezing by midnight. The cup of water she had placed there weeks ago had skinned with ice. Now, on a still cold night with the fire banked, the floor held 2 degrees above freezing. The water in the test cup did not freeze. It was not dramatic. It was not a transformation. A cabin that dropped to 34 degrees at floor level was still brutally cold by any standard of comfort, but it was not below freezing. And the difference, the gap between ice on the floor and no ice on the floor, was the difference between a house that fought you all night and a house that merely did not help. Ragnar showed the numbers to Tolef. He read them without comment. Then he walked outside and held the ledger against the trench wall, comparing the night's data to the 4 previous nights she had recorded. The pattern will hold on still nights, he said. Wind will test it differently. Milton Ash heard about the measurements from Marit, who heard about them from Eli at the schoolhouse. Milton's response was immediate. The improvement was from the extra chinking Ragna had done on the north wall in the 3rd week of October, not from the trench. Ragna had sealed the worst gaps with a clay and grass mixture Tolef had shown her, pressing it into the seams with a flat stick. Milton was not entirely wrong. The chinking helped, but Ragna knew the chinking alone could not explain why the floor temperature had risen while the wall temperature had barely changed. Marit visited and said what practical people say when evidence appears but is not yet overwhelming. Maybe it works when there is no wind. Vale spread a different argument. He told 3 families that the trench would collect snow in the first storm, trap children who fell into it at night, and flood the foundation in spring when the snow melt had nowhere to drain. Each objection was plausible enough to sustain doubt. The trench had not been tested by wind, by heavy snow, or by thaw. It had survived 2 weeks of mild cold on calm nights. That was not proof. That was coincidence, and coincidence made poor insulation. The weather built slowly through November and December. Rail shipments into De Smet slowed as snow accumulated on the tracks. Flour rose to $3 a sack at Vale's store. Hay became scarce. Families that had cut their firewood short began sending children to gather twisted brush from the creek bottoms. Willow sticks and dead cottonwood branches that burned hot for 10 minutes and then disappeared. The conventional problem asserted itself. More fuel was needed every week, and less fuel was available every week. The equation tightened like a noose. Ragna burned carefully. She fed the stove with split pieces no thicker than her wrist, banking the coals at night, and stoking only when the table thermometer dropped below 35. The cracked door hinge on the stove made draft control difficult. She could not close the firebox fully without wiring the door shut, which meant she could not feed the fire without unwinding the wire, which meant every feeding was a production that wasted heat while the door hung open. She recorded everything. Temperature at 3 heights, 3 times a day. Morning, midday, evening. Wind direction noted by the flutter of a cloth strip tied to the west willow stake. Wood burned measured by the shrinking cord pile against the east wall. 1.5 cords at the start of November. 1.25 by the end of November. 1 cord even at Christmas. Tolef returned briefly before Christmas. He arrived in a borrowed sleigh with a cracked rib from a fall on ice at his niece's homestead. He moved slowly, one arm pressed against his side, his breath coming in controlled sips that rationed air the way Ragna rationed wood. He inspected the trench. The banks held. The sod pins were intact. The sump had drained a light snow without pooling. He walked the entire perimeter, pausing at each willow stake, crouching twice to test bank angles that had been exposed to 3 weeks of freeze-thaw. The angles held. Inside the cabin, he asked for the ledger. Ragna gave it to him and watched him read a month of numbers. his finger moving down the columns of floor temperature, table temperature, stove temperature, wind direction, wood burned. He read the way a man reads when numbers are more familiar than words, slowly, thoroughly, trusting each figure to tell him something the one before it had not. Then he did something Ragna had not thought to do. He lit a candle stub from the stove and held it near the floor, 6 inches from the north wall, during a gust that rattled the window paper. The flame leaned, but it leaned gently, a slow bow like a man tipping his hat, not the sharp jerk that Ragna had seen before the trench when the thread snapped inward through the floorboard gaps. He carried the candle outside. He stood at the edge of the trench on the north side and held the candle at waist height over the open cut while the same gust crossed the property. The flame guttered hard, leaning nearly flat before recovering. The air moved fast in the trench. It moved slowly through the floor. Tollef did not declare victory. He blew out the candle and stood in the cold with his cracked rib and his damaged lungs and his eyes on the empty prairie north of the cabin where the wind came from. "Now we wait," he said, "for a wind mean enough to tell the truth." He ate Christmas dinner at Ragna's table, beans, cornbread, a strip of dried beef Marit had sent, and a handful of dried apples Eli had been saving in a tobacco tin he had found in the shed. Torbjörn's cough was quiet that evening. She sat on Tollef's knee and touched the buttons on his coat, counting them in Norwegian because Ragna had taught her the numbers in the old language and the child preferred them. Tollef left on the morning of the 26th. His rib made the sleigh ride painful, and his cough made the cold ride dangerous, and he went anyway because his niece's cabin had no one else, and she had 2 children younger than Torbjörn. Ragna stood at the south crossing and watched the sleigh diminish against the white plain until it was a dark speck and then nothing. The wind picked up from the northwest. She looked at the cloth strip on the west stake. It pointed southeast, flat and stiff. She went inside. She checked the wire on the stove door. She fed 2 sticks into the firebox. She read the thermometers. Floor, 31 degrees. Table, 36. Stove side, 44. January came. The storm arrived on the 14th of January, 1881, 2 hours before sunset. Ragna knew it was coming because the cow would not leave the shelter of the shed. The animal stood with her head lowered and her body pressed against the east wall, facing away from the northwest, and she would not move for grain or water or shouting. Animals knew. They could not read thermometers, but they could feel barometric pressure dropping through their skulls the way miners felt bad air through their headaches. When the cow refused to move, Ragna stopped trying and began preparing. She brought in every piece of split wood within reach, 8 sticks of cottonwood, each about 2 feet long and the thickness of her forearm. She filled the water bucket from the creek, walking fast because the light was changing, the western sky turning a color she had never seen in Norway. Not gray, not white, a yellow-green bruise that spread from horizon to horizon as if the sky itself were injured. She sealed the window with a piece of horse blanket nailed at the corners. She stuffed the worst remaining floor gaps with rags. She fed the stove, tightened the wire on the door hinge, and sat Eli and Torbjörn on the bed with every blanket and quilt she owned piled around them. Torbjörn's cough had been quiet for 2 days. It came back at 4 o'clock like an old debt presenting itself at the worst possible moment. The wind hit at 5:30. It did not build. It did not start as a breeze and grow into a gale the way storms in Norway approached, announcing themselves politely before becoming violent. The Dakota wind arrived at full force, a northwest blast that struck the cabin wall like a fist and stayed. The oiled paper window bowed inward against the horse blanket. The stovepipe hummed. The door on its leather hinges pressed against the latch, and the leather stretched and the latch held, and the leather stretched more. Ragna watched the thread. She had left the test thread tied to its splinter near the north wall floor gap, the same thread she had used weeks ago to discover the drafts. Before the trench, in an ordinary wind, the thread had snapped inward through the gap, pulled by the pressure differential that pumped cold air under the sill and up through the floor. Now, in the worst wind she had experienced since arriving in Dakota, the thread trembled. It shivered. It leaned slightly toward the gap, as if curious. But it did not snap. It did not jerk. It did not stream inward the way it had before. Outside, the wind found the trench. Ragna could not see it in the dark, but she could hear it. The sound was different from the wind hitting the wall. The wall sound was a continuous roar, a pressure that pushed and did not stop. The trench sound was lower, a moan that rose and fell as gusts poured into the 5-foot cut and raced around the cabin's perimeter. The trench was channeling the ground-level air, the coldest, densest layer that had previously slid under the sill, into a circuit that ran 6 feet from the walls and 5 feet below grade. The air took the lower road. Snow moved sideways, not falling, flying. It hit the west wall like sand and accumulated in a drift against the base that grew from nothing to 2 feet in the first hour. But the trench caught snow first. The open cut filled on the windward side as drifting snow poured over the rim and settled into the channel. On the leeward side, the eastee, the trench remained partly open because the sloped banks and the willow stakes broke the drift pattern. Snow accumulated on the stakes and bridged across the top in places, but beneath the bridges, the channel held air. Cold air ran through the trench even as the top filled. Ragna fed the stove at 7 o'clock. She unwound the wire, opened the cracked door, pushed a cottonwood stick into the coals, and closed the door. The wire went back on. The process took 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds, the stove's side thermometer dropped 3 degrees from heat escaping through the open firebox. At 8 o'clock, the stove door hinge snapped. The crack she had been nursing since before Barent's death finally broke through. The hinge pin dropped to the floor and rolled under the stove, and the firebox door swung open on its remaining hinge and hung at an angle, exposing the coals to the room air. The stove began dumping heat. Smoke curled from the gap where the door no longer sealed. The draft, which depended on a closed firebox to draw air up through the pipe, stuttered and reversed, and a puff of gray smoke rolled into the cabin at ceiling height. Ragna grabbed the flat iron from the shelf. She pressed it flat against the open side of the firebox door, holding it in place with her bare hand on the wooden handle. The iron was cold. Within seconds, it began absorbing heat from the coals. She held it there while the smoke cleared and the draft re-established through the pipe. Then she wrapped a length of wire around the flat iron and the stove body, cinching the iron against the firebox opening like a splint on a broken limb. The seal was imperfect. Air leaked around the edges of the flat iron. The stove burned less efficiently, consuming wood faster because the draft was inconsistent. Each stick of cottonwood that might have lasted 40 minutes now lasted 30. 8 sticks, 30 minutes each, 4 hours of fuel. The storm showed no sign of ending. Ragna looked at the wood. She looked at the stove. She looked at her children on the bed, Torbjörn coughing into the blankets, and Eli sitting rigid with his jaw set and his eyes on the flat iron wired to the stove. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next few hours decide whether the trench is protection or just a hole in the dark. She did not panic. She rationed. She loosened the wire on the flat iron slightly, allowing more air leak, which reduced the burn rate, but also reduced the heat output. The calculation was brutal. Burn fast and stay warm, but run out of fuel before dawn, or burn slow and stay cold, but keep the coals alive until morning. She chose slow. The cabin temperature dropped. At 9 o'clock, stove side 48 degrees, table height 39, floor near the north wall 31, cold but not freezing. Ragna checked the thread, still trembling, still not streaming. The trench was working, even in a full gale, even with the windward side buried in snow. The lower road held. At 10 o'clock, Eli asked to go out. The cow was in the shed and had not been watered since afternoon. Ragna said no. Eli said the cow would die. Ragna said the cow would live one night without water. Eli said his father would have gone. The sentence landed like a stone in still water, and for a moment neither of them moved. Ragna let him go. She tied a rope around his waist, looped the other end through the door latch, and sent him into the dark with a lantern. He was gone 4 minutes. He came back with one cheek white from frostbite, a patch the size of a silver dollar above his jaw where the wind had found bare skin between his scarf and his hat. Ragna pressed her warm palm against the white spot and held it there until color returned. The skin would blister and peel. He would carry a faint scar for the rest of his life, a half moon of smooth skin that never tanned properly. The cow was alive. The shed held. Eli did not ask to go out again. At 11:30, the third complication arrived in the form of pounding on the door. Marit Lunde stood on the south plank crossing with her infant grandson wrapped in a quilt against her chest. Her face was raw, her eyes streaming, her coat crusted with driven snow. Behind her, the dark was absolute. No stars, no moon, no horizon, just wind and white. Marit's daughter lived a quarter-mile east. Her stove had smoked out, the pipe had iced shut during the gale, and when she opened the firebox to clear it, the cabin filled with carbon smoke. She had sent the older children to the root cellar and given the baby to Marit, who had fought her way to the nearest light she could see. Ragna's light. The lantern in the window, visible because the Brecka cabin sat on a slight rise, and the horse blanket over the window did not cover the top corner where the nail had pulled loose. Ragna had opened the door. Opening the door would dump the cabin's heat into the gale. The temperature would plunge. The stove, already burning on reduced draft with a flat iron splint, would fight for an hour to recover what 3 seconds of open door would destroy. She thought about Tolef's lessons, not the trench, the principle, how to manage the movement of air, how cold entered and warm left. The door was a sill gap at human scale. Eli, she said, take the quilt from the foot of the bed, hold it across the doorway at waist height. When I open the door, Marit comes under the quilt. You keep the quilt tight. I close the door. 3 seconds. Eli stood. He was 9 years old, and his cheek was blistering from frostbite, and his hands shook. He took the quilt and held it. Ragna unlatched the door. The wind hit it like a shoulder. She braced her foot against the base. Marit ducked under the quilt with the baby against her chest. Eli pressed the quilt against the door frame. Ragna slammed the door and latched it. The cold that entered settled on the floor in a layer she could feel through her stockings. But the quilt had blocked the upper half of the doorway, and the warm air at ceiling and table height had stayed. The stove side thermometer dropped 4 degrees. The table dropped 2. The floor dropped 7. Within 20 minutes, the stove recovered the table temperature. The floor took longer, but it recovered. Marit sat on the bed with the baby and looked at the thermometers on the wall. She looked at the thread near the north floor gap, still trembling and not streaming. She looked at Ragna feeding a cottonwood stick into the flat iron brace stove with the careful movements of someone who knows exactly how many sticks remain. How is your floor not frozen? Marit asked. The trench, Ragna said. Marit said nothing. She held the baby and watched the thread. The longest hours came between midnight and 4 in the morning. The temperature outside dropped to a depth Ragna could not measure because she did not have an exterior thermometer, but the nail heads on the door developed frost rings and the leather hinges stiffened until they creaked like ice on a pond. She fed the stove at intervals she calculated by the table thermometer. When it dropped below 35, she added a stick. When it recovered to 38, she stopped. 6 sticks burned between 9 o'clock and 4 in the morning. 2 remained. Dawn was still 2 hours away. The storm had not stopped. If anything, the wind had increased after midnight, and the snow on the windward trench had overtopped the willow stakes and spilled across the spoil apron toward the cabin wall. Ragna broke a piece from the plank crossing on the south side. It was not firewood. It was green cottonwood, dense and wet, and it smoked badly when she put it in the stove. But it burned. She coughed. The baby coughed. Torbjörg, who had slept through Marit's arrival and the door opening and the hours of rationed heat, woke and coughed with them. For 10 minutes the cabin was a chorus of coughing. Then the smoke cleared. The green wood caught properly and burned with a sullen, steady heat that the dry cottonwood had not produced. The stove side temperature climbed to 44. The table held at 36. The floor read 29 chas, below freezing for the first time since the trench was completed, but only by 3 degrees and only at floor level near the north wall. In Milton Ash's cabin, on a rise 2 miles southwest of the Brecke claim, with full chinking on all 4 walls, and 6.5 cords of split oak stacked under a shelter, the floor bucket froze solid before midnight. Marit would learn this later. She would learn that Milton's table thermometer read 9 degrees at its lowest, 30 degrees colder at the same height than Ragna's reading. She would learn that Milton had tried to haul wood from his shelter during the gale, collapsed in the snow between his shed and his door, and was found by Deputy Wallace Pike before dawn, half buried and barely conscious, with 2 fingers on his left hand frozen white to the second knuckle. The fingers would be lost. The man would survive. But the hand that had held the carpenter's square against the trench bank would never hold it again with full grip. Another settler, Ansel Crow, who lived 4 miles north in a claim shanty no better than Ragna's, but with no trench, nearly died when the floor drafts in his cabin blew out his lamp and the smoke from his poorly drawing stove filled the room. His wife dragged him outside in her nightclothes, and they spent 3 hours in the root cellar with 2 blankets and a lantern before the air cleared enough to re-enter the cabin. Crow survived. His youngest daughter's toes turned black, and Marit heard later that the doctor in town said they would likely recover, but they would hurt every winter for the rest of the girl's life. The storm broke at 6:30 in the morning. The wind did not stop, it diminished. The roar became a moan, and the moan became a hiss, and the hiss became silence, and the silence was the loudest sound Ragna had heard in 13 hours. She opened the door. The prairie was white and still and scoured. The trench on the windward side was buried, a smooth white blanket running from the cabin wall to the willow stakes and beyond, the whole cut filled with packed snow. On the leeward side, the trench was half open. Snow had bridged across the top in sections where the stakes were closest together, but beneath the bridges, the channel held. She could see the dark earth of the trench bottom through gaps in the snow cover, and the bottom was dry. The sump pit had drained the meltwater before it could pool. The air in the trench was still. Not warm, still. No movement, no wind racing through the cut. The storm had passed, and the trench had done what a trench does when the wind stops. Nothing. But during the storm, when the wind had been a force that could kill a man between his shed and his door, The trench had given the coldest air a road that ran below the floor and around the cabin instead of through it. Ragnar's floor had held at 29 degrees at its worst during the darkest hour of the worst storm she would ever face in Dakota. Milton's floor had been cold enough to freeze a bucket solid. The difference was not 30 degrees of added warmth. It was 30 degrees of stolen cold that the trench had diverted into the earth instead of through her home. The 30 degrees was not what the trench gave. It was what the trench refused to take. Tullif arrived 2 days later in the borrowed sleigh, moving so slowly that Ragna saw him on the road for 20 minutes before he reached the crossing. His rib was taped with cloth, and his cough was worse, and his eyes were bright the way eyes are bright when a fever has been building for days, and the body is spending reserves it cannot replenish. He walked the trench. He examined the snowfill on the windward side, the open channel on the leeward side, the intact sump pit, the willow stakes standing through the drift. He went inside and asked for the ledger. Rana gave it to him. He read the numbers from the night of the storm, every entry, every temperature, every note about wind direction and wood consumed and the flat iron on the stove door. He read the way he read everything, with his finger on the page and his lips slightly parted, each number absorbed before the next was considered. He looked at the children. Torbjörg was asleep on the bed. Eli was outside, shoveling the south crossing clear. Marit's grandson had gone home with his grandmother that morning, alive and warm and screaming for milk. Tullif closed the ledger. He held it in both hands on the table and looked at the cover. Berndt's name in ink, the store accounts beneath, and the temperature columns Ragna had added in pencil on the reverse pages, transforming a record of debt into a record of survival. "You measured what they laughed at," he said. Ragna did not answer. She was feeding the stove. The flat iron was still wired to the door. The hinge was still broken. The cabin was still cold. But the floor was dry. The children were alive. And the ledger held numbers that would change how Milton Ash thought about wind and cold, and the things a woman could build with a mattock and a length of string. Outside, Eli finished shoveling the crossing and leaned the spade against the willow stake nearest the door. The cloth strip at the top of the stake was gone, torn away by the storm. He untied a thread from his cuff, one of the test threads his mother had used to find the drafts, and tied it to the stake in place of the missing strip. It hung limp. The air was still. Milton Ash came to the Bricka cabin 4 days after the storm, with his left hand wrapped in a bandage that smelled of carbolic acid and showed blood at the edges. He did not ride the gray mare. He walked because holding reins required 2 functional hands, and he had lost the use of his smallest and ring fingers on the left, both of them blackened past the second knuckle and bound together with a strip of linen the doctor in De Smet had soaked in whiskey before tying. Ragna saw him coming from the south crossing. She did not go to meet him. She stood at the edge of the trench with the mattock in her hand. She had been clearing packed snow from the windward sections all morning, and watched Milton walk the final 100 yards with his head down and his wrapped hand held against his stomach. He stopped at the trench rim. He looked into the cut. The windward side was half cleared. Dark earth showed through white-crusted snow in alternating stripes where Ragna had shoveled. The leeward side was open, the banks clean, the sump draining a trickle of meltwater that caught the January light. Milton said, "I want to see the ledger." Ragna leaned the mattock against a willow stake and went inside. She brought the ledger out and handed it to him. He held it in his right hand, his working hand, and opened it to the storm night page. He read the columns. Floor temperature, table temperature, stove temperature, wind direction, wood burned. He read the entries from the nights before the storm, and the entries from the nights after, and the storm night entries that showed the cabin holding at temperatures. His own cabin had not come close to matching, despite his 6.5 cords of split oak and his full chinking and his raised plank floor with no gaps wider than a knife blade. He closed the ledger. He looked at the trench. He looked at his bandaged hand. "I knew walls," Milton said. "I did not know the wind under a floor." He did not apologize. He did not say he had been wrong. He said what he knew and what he had not known, and the space between those two statements contained everything an apology would have held without the weight of a man dismantling his own authority in front of a woman he had dismissed. Ragna said, "Do you want to measure the trench?" Milton looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the recognition that he was being offered participation rather than humiliation. She was not rubbing his face in it. She was handing him the carpenter's square. "Yes," he said. They spent the afternoon measuring. Milton used his right hand to hold the square and his injured left to brace it, wincing each time pressure reached the bandaged fingers. He measured bank angles, trench width at the top and bottom, depth at 8-foot intervals, slope grade on the trench floor. He recorded each number in the margin of the ledger page in handwriting that was smaller and tighter than Ragna's, because he had been trained to letter construction plans, and the habit survived even with a hand that would never fully close again. When he finished, he stood at the south crossing and said, "The depth matters more than the width. The slope matters more than the depth, and the sump matters more than all of it." It was the first time Milton Ash had spoken about the trench, as if it were a structure worthy of analysis instead of a novelty worthy of ridicule. The conversion was not sentimental. It was professional. He had been a builder his whole life, and the trench was a building he had not recognized because it went down instead of up. Marit came the next day. She did not bring bean soup or pickled beets or advice. She brought her husband's shovel and a ball of string. "Show me the measurements," she said. Ragna showed her. 6 feet from the wall, 5 feet deep where the soil would hold. 4 feet wide at the top, narrowing to 2.5. Banks battered at 1 hand's width back for every 2 hands' depth. Sump pit at the lowest natural corner, deep enough to drain standing water within 2 hours. Marit listened. She asked one question. "How many days?" 31, Ragna said, "with help for 12 of them." Marit looked at the trench, looked at the cabin, looked at the thermometers visible through the open door. She said, "My floor froze 6 out of 7 nights last week. My eldest sleeps with his boots on." That was the conversion. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement of error, not apology for the grave-digging remark. A fact about boots and frozen floors. Marit had been converted not by Ragna's argument, but by her own children's discomfort, and the proof was in the ledger that Milton had measured and verified with a carpenter's square held in a hand that had lost 2 fingers to the cold the trench had diverted. Others followed. Deputy Wallace Pike arrived on the 3rd day after Milton's visit. He had seen the bricky cabin lit during the storm, seen its lantern burning steadily from 2 miles away while other claims went dark, and he wanted to know why. Ragna showed him the trench. Pike was not a builder, he was a deputy. But he understood evidence, and the ledger was evidence. 2 families from north of town came the following week. The Freers, who had lost a milk cow to exposure during the storm, and the Ingrams, whose cabin had been so cold that the wife slept sitting up in a chair by the stove for 3 nights because the bed against the far wall was below freezing. They stood at the trench rim and looked into the cut and asked the same questions everyone asked. How deep? How wide? How long did it take? Ragna shared the design freely. She did not charge. She did not bargain. She had not built the trench to start a business. She had built it to keep her children alive, and the knowledge belonged to anyone whose children were also cold. But sharing was not the same as teaching. The freers wanted to start digging immediately. Ragna stopped them. She made the eldest freer son hold the string line while she showed him how to mark the 6-foot setback from the cabin wall. She made Milton test the soil at the freer claim with his square and pronounce it sandy, which meant deeper sod pinning and a wider bottom to prevent collapse. She made Marit hold a cup of water at the proposed sump location and watch where it ran to determine the natural low point. Each instruction was a scene. Each scene was a confrontation with ignorance that could kill if left uncorrected. A trench dug too steep in sandy soil would cave in during the first thaw and bury anyone standing in it. A sump placed on a high point would pool water against the foundation instead of draining it away. A trench cut too shallow would catch snow but not cold air, turning the investment of labor into a liability. Ragna taught the way Tollef had taught her, by demonstration, correction, and silence when correction was no longer needed. She did not lecture, she showed. And when the student got it right, she moved on without praise because praise was not the point, and the cold did not care whether you felt good about your work. The measurable results accumulated. Ragna had burned 2¼ cords from October through March. Milton, in his conventional cabin with full chinking and superior firewood, had burned over 4 cords and still had frozen floorboards every night. The temperature dropped below 0. The comparison was not universal. It was these 2 cabins, these 2 winters, these 2 methods. Ragna said so whenever anyone asked. She did not claim the trench would work everywhere. She claimed it had worked here, under these conditions, measured with these instruments, and the ledger was available to anyone who wanted to see the numbers. That precision irritated Vale more than boasting would have. A woman making grand claims could be dismissed. A woman with a ledger full of measurements, verified by the town's most respected builder, could not. Vale's response was tactical. He told 3 families that the trench was a public hazard. A child had already slipped near the edge, the Shields boy, who had been throwing snowballs and ran too close to the unmarked south section. The boy was unhurt, but the story grew in Vale's telling until the trench became a death trap waiting for a toddler or a drunk or a horse that shied at the wrong moment. Ragna responded by adding willow rail markers along every section of the trench rim, spaced 5 feet apart, with a cross piece at knee height that was visible in poor light. She built plank covers only at the crossing points. She did not cover the trench itself because covering it would block the air channel and defeat the purpose. The markers and crossings were a concession to safety. They were also a signal that Ragna was not interested in fighting Vale's arguments. She was interested in removing them. Vale saw the markers go up and understood what they meant. The widow was not only surviving, she was fortifying. Every practical objection he raised, she answered with practical action, and each answer made her position stronger and his weaker. The claim that had been a vulnerable asset waiting for foreclosure was becoming a demonstration site, and demonstration sites attracted allies. He needed a new angle. He would find one. But for now, the trench had turned the arithmetic of the winter against him. An arithmetic, unlike gossip, did not respond to repetition. Tollef returned in late February, thin and slow, and carrying a sack of dried beans he said he had won in a card game, though Ragna suspected he had bought them with money he could not afford to spend. His cough had settled into a rhythm. 4 wet barks, a pause for breath, 2 more barks, silence. The pattern repeated every few minutes, as reliable as the ticking of a clock, and just as impossible to ignore. He inspected the trench the way he always did, walking the full perimeter, testing bank angles, checking sod pins, pouring water from the tin cup to verify slope. The freeze-thaw cycles of midwinter had cracked two sections on the west wall where the soil was heaviest in clay. The cracks were vertical, running from the rim to 3 feet down, and the bank bulged outward slightly on either side of each crack. "Spring will take these," Tollef said. "When the frost lets go, the clay swells and the bank shears. Recut these two sections before thaw. Wider at the bottom, more batter on the face." They worked together that afternoon, Ragna cutting and Tollef directing from the rim, because the act of climbing down into the trench required a breath reserve he no longer possessed. He sat on an overturned bucket with his coat open despite the cold, his chest working, and he told her things about soil that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with a life spent understanding the ground beneath human structures. He told her that the canal men in Fargo divided soil into three kinds: the kind that worked with you, the kind that worked against you, and the kind that pretended to work with you until you trusted it. Clay was the third kind. It held a shape beautifully in dry weather and betrayed it the moment water arrived. The only way to manage clay was to assume betrayal and engineer for it: wider cuts, deeper drainage, walls that expected to move and had room to move without failing. He told her about a stretch of canal near Bismarck where the soil changed character every 40 feet, sand to clay to gravel to clay again, and the foreman wanted one specification for the entire run. Tollef had argued for 4 different cross-sections tailored to 4 different soils. The foreman said that was too complicated for the crew. Tollef said the crew was not the one who would drown when the canal collapsed in the wrong place. The foreman relented. The canal held. Tollef was fired anyway because a man who is right in a way that embarrasses his superior has chosen correctness over employment, and employment does not forgive that choice. Ragna listened. She did not compare the story to her own situation, because the comparison was obvious and stating obvious things wasted time. Instead, she asked a question that had been forming since the night of the storm. Should the trench be shallower for families with weaker soil? Tollef looked at her. It was the first time she had asked about someone else's trench instead of her own. The question marked a change he had been waiting for, the shift from survivor to teacher, from someone who had built a thing to someone who understood the principle behind the thing. "How shallow?" he asked. 3 feet, faster to dig, less risk of collapse, easier for families with children near the edge. "Test it." They tested it. Tollef suggested a 3-foot trial cut near Marit Lunde's cabin, where the soil was a mix of sand and topsoil that would not hold a 5-foot bank without heavy pinning. Ragna dug a 10-foot section at 3 feet deep with battered sides and a sod-pinned south face. They placed Berndt's spare thermometer, the one Ragna normally kept at table height, on the floor near Marit's north wall and waited for a cold night with steady wind. The result was clear but disappointing. The 3-foot cut reduced floor drafts, but the effect was roughly half what the 5-foot trench produced. On a night when Ragna's floor held at 32, Marit's floor with the 3-foot trial read 26. Better than no trench, not as good as the full depth. Tollef and Ragna argued about what the numbers meant. It was their first real disagreement, and it mattered because it revealed different philosophies rooted in different experiences. Tollef said 3 feet was good enough for most families. The labor savings meant more families could build trenches before the next winter. A method that worked halfway but was built by 20 families was more valuable than a method that worked fully but was built by 3. Ragna said depth was the mechanism, the cold air sank. If the channel was not deep enough to catch the densest layer, the air slid over the rim and under the sill anyway. 3 feet helped, 5 feet solved the problem. Teaching people to build something that half worked was teaching them to trust a half solution. "You want perfection," Tollef said. Perfection is for people with time. I want the floor above freezing, Ragna said. That is not perfection. That is the difference between frozen boots and bare feet. They did not resolve the argument. They agreed to let each family decide based on their soil, their labor, and their tolerance for depth. It was a compromise that satisfied neither of them, which meant it was probably correct. Tollef died on the 9th of April, 1881. His lungs had been failing since before Ragna met him, but the winter accelerated the decline. The cracked rib from the ice fall never fully healed because his coughing stressed the fracture every few minutes, and by March the cough produced flecks of blood that he wiped from his lips with the back of his hand when he thought no one was watching. Eli watched. Eli always watched. The wet April thaw brought warm air that should have eased his breathing, but instead filled his damaged lungs with moisture they could not expel. He spent the last week of his life at Ragna's cabin, not because she had invited him, but because he could no longer drive the mule cart, and his niece's homestead was 12 miles away, and 12 miles might as well have been 1,200. He sat in the chair near the stove. Ragna gave him the warm side of the cabin, the side where the stove thermometer read 48 degrees even on cold evenings. He read Eli's temperature entries in the ledger, correcting the boy's handwriting without comment. A number formed backward here, a date written with the month and day transposed there. He told Torbjörg the names of the willow stakes in Norwegian, giving each one a character and a personality the way he had given characters to canal sections years ago, when the work was monotonous and his lungs still allowed him to speak in full sentences. On the morning of the 9th, Ragna woke early and found him sitting in the chair with the ledger open on his lap. He was not reading it. He was holding it. His breathing had changed overnight, not the familiar bark-pause-bark pattern, but something shallower and faster, as if his chest were sipping air through a crack instead of drawing it through a door. Eli sat beside him. The boy had been reading the temperature entries aloud, the latest week's numbers, the comparisons with January, the fuel consumption that showed a steady decline as the days lengthened and the trench's drainage cut channeled snow melt away from the sill stones. Tollef listened. He did not correct Eli's handwriting. He did not comment on the numbers. He looked at Ragna once, and in that look she saw everything a person can communicate when words cost more breath than the lungs can pay. He said one thing, not to Ragna, not to Eli, to the room or to the stove, or to the memory of every canal he had cut and every wall he had battered and every foreman who had fired him for being right in the wrong way. Do not teach them the whole, Tollef said. Teach them to see where the cold wants to go. He closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. By midday the pattern stopped. Ragna did not cry. She had stopped crying on the day she buried Bernd, and the same prohibition held now, enforced by the same economy, and tears cost time, and she had a man to bury and children to feed, and a trench to maintain, and a spring thaw to manage. She wrapped Tollef in the quilt he had slept under, and Eli helped her carry him to the wagon. Milton Ash dug the grave, using his right hand on the spade, and his damaged left to steady the handle. The cemetery was near town, and the soil was wet enough to dig without a mattock, and Milton said nothing about the work because saying nothing was the most he could offer. They buried Tollef Asen on the 10th of April in a plot without a headstone because Ragna could not afford one. She marked it with a willow stake. Not because it matched the trench, she was not that sentimental, but because willow was what she had, and markers were what she understood. And a man who had taught her to read soil and batter banks and see where water wanted to go deserved at least one stake in the ground to say he had been there. She walked back to the cabin. She entered through the south crossing. She fed the stove. She checked the thermometers. The floor read 37 degrees. The table read 44. The stove side read 56. Outside, the April sun had dried the trench bottom on the south and east sections, and new grass was beginning to creep over the rim where the spoil apron met the prairie. Ragna opened the ledger. She turned past the temperature columns to a blank page. She wrote, in pencil, in Norwegian, Tollef Åsen, kanalgrava, Lea, død, 9. april 1891. Han lærte mig å se, kanaldigger, teacher. He taught me to see. She closed the ledger. He went outside. The trench was there, circling the cabin in its patient rectangle, and the willow stakes stood along the rim, and the spring melt ran slowly through the sump pit, and the world continued to move in the directions it had always moved. Cold downward, warm upward, water toward the lowest point it could find. Tollef's principle lived in the soil. Whether Ragna could carry it without him was the question the next winter would answer. The answer came in January of 1882, and it arrived not at Ragna's cabin, but at Marit Lunde's. The previous autumn had been strange, warm days stretching deep into October, followed by an abrupt freeze in the first week of November that caught the ground still saturated from late rains. The thaw-freeze cycle that Tollef had warned about cracked trench banks across 3 homesteads that had dug some version of Ragna's design. The cracks were manageable. Ragni walked each site, showed the families how to recut the damaged sections, and demonstrated the sod pinning technique Tollef had taught her. The repairs held. But Marit's trench had a problem that repairs could not reach. Her eldest son, a boy of 14 named Jerome, had been dumping fireplace ashes into the sump pit throughout December because carrying them to the ash pile behind the shed meant crossing the icy plank bridge over the trench, and Jerome had slipped on the bridge twice and decided the sump was closer and no one would notice. No one noticed until the ashes clogged the sump. The clog did not matter in dry cold, but when the January thaw came, 3 days of warm wind that melted a week's worth of snow and sent water streaming across every flat surface on the prairie, the clogged sump could not drain. Water pooled in the trench bottom, rose to 18 inches, and froze solid when the temperature dropped again 2 days later. The ice sealed the trench like a lid. Cold air could no longer drop into the channel. The lower road was closed. Marit's floor temperature plunged. In one night, it dropped from 30 to 19 degrees. By the second night, it hit 12. The newborn Cassius, Marit's second grandchild, 3 months old, named Clara, slept in a crate beside the stove, and Marit moved the crate every hour to keep it on the warm side as the stove heat shifted with the wind. Her daughter fed the baby in a chair wrapped in blankets, her own breath visible in the lantern light. Marit sent Jerome to fetch Ragna at dawn on the 3rd morning. The boy arrived at the Breka cabin on foot, hatless, crying from the cold and from the guilt he could not yet articulate. Ragna did not ask what had happened. She looked at his face and put on her coat. She arrived at Marit's cabin without Tollef. That fact pressed on her chest like a stone as she walked the half-mile between the 2 homesteads. Every problem she had solved since the first storm, Tollef had been alive somewhere, available by sleigh, by message, by the knowledge that if she made an error, someone who understood soil better than she did could correct it. Now there was no correction available. There was only what she had learned and what she had not yet needed to learn, and the gap between those 2 things was the distance between competence and the kind of pretending that gets people killed. She reached Marit's trench and saw the problem immediately. The sump was a gray mass of frozen ash and ice, solid from rim to bottom. The trench on either side of the sump held 6 inches of ice, where the pooled water had spread before freezing. She knelt and hit the surface with the back of the mattock head. The ice was hard, not brittle. It had frozen slowly, in layers, and each layer had bonded to the one beneath it. She stood and looked at the trench. She looked at the cabin. She heard through the closed door the thin cry of a baby that had been cold for 3 days. She chopped the sump open. It took 40 minutes. The ash-ice mixture was dense and heavy, and each swing of the mattock sent chips flying that stung her face and hands. She cleared the sump to 2 feet below the trench floor, then cut a relief channel from the pooled section into the cleared sump, a narrow gutter 6 inches wide and 4 inches deep, angled to carry meltwater from the ice blockage into the restored drain. The ice in the trench would not melt fast enough on its own. She needed to break it. She stood in the trench and swung the mattock in short, controlled strokes, cracking the ice layer without damaging the bank beneath it. Each crack let water seep downward into the soil, loosening the ice's grip on the trench floor. She worked for an hour. Jerome stood on the rim watching her, his face swollen from crying and cold. Milton Ash arrived at midday. He had seen Jerome running that morning and followed the boy's tracks. He stood at the trench rim with his damaged hand in his coat pocket and watched Ragna chop ice. He did not offer advice. He did not suggest a better method. He waited until she paused for breath and then said, "What do you need?" It was the first time Milton Ash had asked Ragna Breaky that question. Every previous exchange had been the reverse. Milton telling Ragna what she needed, Milton prescribing solutions, Milton dispensing the authority of experience to a woman he assumed lacked it. Now he stood at the edge of a frozen trench and asked. "Snow," Ragna said. "Pull loose snow from the north drift and pack it against the exposed corner of the cabin where the trench is still blocked. The snow will break the wind at floor level until I clear the channel." Milton looked at the north corner. The trench there was sealed with ice. The cabin wall above it was exposed to the full wind. He understood immediately. The temporary snow windbreak would do crudely what the trench did precisely, blocking the ground-level airflow until the trench could resume its function. He pulled snow. He packed it with his one good hand and his damaged one, pressing the snow against the cabin's north sill in a berm 2 feet high and 3 feet wide. It was rough work. The berm would not last. But it did not need to last. It needed to work for the hours it took Ragna to clear the ice from the remaining trench sections. By late afternoon, the sump was draining. The relief channel carried meltwater from the cracked ice into the restored pit. The trench on the leeward side was open. The windward side was still partially blocked, but Ragna had cracked the ice enough to allow airflow through gaps between the fragments. That evening, Marit's floor temperature rose from 12 degrees to 24. Not warm, not safe. But 12 degrees warmer than it had been, and 12 degrees was the difference between a baby in a crate by the stove and a baby in a crate against the far wall. And that difference was 12 degrees of space in a cabin that had none to spare. Ragna told Jerome to clear the sump every week. She told him to carry the ashes to the ash pile. She told him that if the ash pile was too far, he should make a closer one, but not in the trench and not in the sump and not anywhere water drained. Jerome nodded. He'd spent 3 days watching his grandmother move the baby's crate every hour, and the lesson had been delivered in a language more persuasive than Ragna's words. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built before anyone believes in it. Marit stood in the doorway that evening and watched Ragna walk home across the dark prairie. She said nothing. She had said nothing when Ragna arrived, and she had said nothing during the hours of chopping and clearing and rebuilding, and she said nothing now. But the next morning she sent Jerome to the Breca cabin with a jar of preserved plums and a note written in careful English that said, "Thank you for coming without being asked." Ragna read the note. She put the plums on the shelf. She opened the ledger and wrote Marit's floor temperatures from the 3 crisis days, then the recovery temperature from that evening. Tolliff would have wanted the numbers recorded. Tolliff would have wanted to know what a clogged sump did to a 3-foot trench, and how long the recovery took, and whether the relief channel could be made a permanent feature of the design. She was teaching herself now. Every failure was a lesson Tolliff could not deliver from a grave marked with a willow stake, and every lesson was a revision of the design that made the next failure less likely. The trench was not a finished thing. It was a system that required maintenance, understanding, and the willingness to stand in a frozen ditch in January, chopping ice because a 14-year-old boy had been too lazy to walk to the ash pile. That was what Tolliff had meant, not the hole, the seeing. The cold wanted to go where it always wanted to go, down, along, under. The trench gave it a path, but the path had to stay open, and staying open required someone who understood why the path mattered and what happened when it closed. Ragna walked the trench every morning that winter. She checked the sump, she checked the banks, she checked the willow stakes. She carried the mattock in one hand and the ledger in the other, and she wrote what she saw, and what she saw was a system that worked when it was maintained and failed when it was neglected, and that distinction was the entire lesson of everything she had learned since the day she watched a thread jerk through a floorboard gap and understood that the enemy was not the cold, but the movement of the cold. 12 families had built some version of the trench by the spring of 1882, not all full depth, not all properly sloped, not all with functioning sumps, but 12 families who had spent the previous winter burning 4 and 5 cords of wood and sleeping in boots now burned less and slept in stockings. And the difference, multiplied by 12, was a community that had shifted its relationship to winter by 6 feet of depth and one woman's insistence that the floor mattered more than the walls. Vale watched the shift. He watched families come to Ragna for advice. He watched Milton Ash measure trench dimensions with a carpenter's square and record them in a notebook he carried in his coat. He watched Marit Lunda tell other women that the trench worked, and he watched those women tell their husbands, and he watched the husbands dig. He had lost the narrative. The moat was no longer a joke. It was a method, and methods had adherents. And adherents were people who no longer needed Orson Vale to tell them what was possible and what was foolish. He needed a new approach. The public hazard argument had been answered by the willow rails. The cost argument had been answered by the fuel savings. The technical argument had been answered by the ledger. What remained was the one weapon the trench could not deflect, the debt note, $14.60 plus interest. Ragna had not paid it. She had not been able to pay it. The $9.30 in the tin had been spent on lamp oil, salt, flour, and tallow candles over the course of the winter. The note remained, and Vale held it, and the law did not care how many trenches a widow dug if her creditors demanded payment. He would wait. He had always been good at waiting. But the window was closing, and when it closed, the moat builder would have subjects instead of debts, and Orson Vale would be a storekeeper in a town that no longer needed his permission to survive. Spring of 1882 exposed the trench to a threat Ragna had planned for, but never tested at scale. The thaw came fast. 4 days of south wind that dissolved the packed snow into water that ran across the prairie in sheets, pooling in every low spot, filling every depression, and pouring over the trench rims in muddy cascades that carried grass and ice crystals and the debris of 5 months of winter into the 5-foot cut. The windward sections flooded first. The packed snow that had filled them during the storms now melted from the surface down, and the water had nowhere to go but the trench bottom. The sump handled the first day's melt. By the second day, the volume exceeded the sump's drainage rate, and standing water reached 8 inches in the deepest section on the north side. Vale heard about the flooding from a man who had ridden past the Brecka claim and seen water glinting in the trench. He mentioned it at the store that afternoon with the tone of a man whose prediction has finally been verified. "The moat is filling," he said. "By May, her sill stones will be sitting in a bath." Ragna did not wait for May. She had listened to Tolef's warnings about water and sills, and she had spent the winter thinking about what spring would demand. On the third day of thaw, she deepened the sump by 18 inches, using the mattock to break through a layer of clay that Tolef had identified in the autumn as the drainage floor, the point below which water seeped into the subsoil rather than pooling on the surface. The deeper sump drained faster, but faster was not fast enough for the volume of melt pouring in from two directions. She cut an overflow channel, a shallow run, 8 inches deep, 12 inches wide, leading from the sump pit across 30 feet of flat ground to the natural swale that crossed the southeast corner of her property. The swale was lower than the trench bottom by 2 feet. Gravity would carry the overflow. The channel took a day and a half to dig, and when she finished and the melt reached the sump, and the sump filled and the water spilled into the channel and ran downhill to the swale, she stood at the edge of the swale and watched the water disappear into the grass and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem solved before it became a catastrophe. She raised 2 sill stones on the north wall, the wall where moisture was heaviest, by sliding flat creek stones underneath them, lifting the cabin's contact point with the ground by 3 inches. It was not elegant. The north wall sat slightly higher than the other 3, and the door frame tilted a 1/4 inch. But the sill stones no longer touched wet soil, and wet soil was rot, and rot was the enemy that came after cold, quieter, and slower, but just as final. She lined the wettest corner of the trench with flat stones scavenged from the abandoned foundation of a homestead 2 miles east that had been surrendered the previous spring. The stones were heavy. She carried them 4 at a time in a grain sack slung over her good shoulder. The left one, because the right shoulder that had swung the mattock for 31 days the previous autumn now ached in a grinding, permanent way that would follow her for the rest of her life. The stone lining kept the trench bottom from turning to mud in the wettest section and gave the water a smooth surface to flow across toward the sump. The spring work transformed the trench from a winter intervention into a maintained system. It had seasons now. Autumn was for bank repair, sod pinning, and sump clearing. Winter was for monitoring, recording, and fuel management. Spring was for drainage, overflow, and stonework. Summer was for deepening, widening, and teaching. And she taught. Through the spring and summer of 1882, Ragna led 5 families in adapting the trench design to their specific sites. Each adaptation was a negotiation between the principal and the ground. For Marit Lund's cabin, which sat on exposed flat ground with sandy soil, Ragna designed a full 5-foot trench with heavy sod pinning on all 4 sides and a double sump, 2 pits connected by a relief channel so that if one clogged, the other could handle the load. She told Jerome that if she ever found ashes in either sump, she would fill both of them with creek water and make him bale them dry with a tin cup. Jerome believed her. For a cabin near a natural depression west of town, where the ground sloped enough to provide partial cold air drainage without a trench, she designed a half-moon cut on the exposed north and west sides only, 3.5 feet deep, with a shallow overflow running into the existing low point. The half-moon cost half the labor and provided roughly 2/3 of the benefit. It was a compromise Tolef would have approved and Ragna accepted because the family had 4 children under 10 and a father with a bad back who could not dig full depth without risk of injury that would leave his family worse off than cold floors. For Deputy Pike's claimed shanty, which was small and poorly built and sat on a slight rise that drained naturally on 3 sides, she designed a cold pocket, a single trench section on the north side only, 4 feet deep and 20 feet long, positioned to intercept the prevailing wind's ground-level flow before it reached the shanty's north wall. The cold pocket was not a full solution, but Pike was a bachelor with no children and a tolerance for discomfort that exceeded his tolerance for digging, and the pocket reduced his floor drafts enough that he stopped sleeping in his boots, which he considered a complete victory. Each adaptation created its own tension. Not every site worked equally. A trench dug in heavy clay on the freer property held its banks beautifully, but drained so slowly that standing water became a permanent feature until Ragna showed the eldest freer son how to deepen the sump below the clay layer into the gravel beneath. A trench dug too close to a well on the Ingram property threatened to divert groundwater, and Ragna had to redesign the layout to route the overflow away from the wellhead, adding 40 feet of channel that doubled the labor. The failures mattered as much as the successes. Each failure taught Ragna something Tollef had not lived long enough to teach her, not because he lacked the knowledge, but because some lessons could only be delivered by soil that behaved differently than expected, or water that ran in directions that defied the slope, or families that maintained their trenches carelessly because maintenance was invisible work, and invisible work was the first work that people stopped doing. She kept notebooks, not the single ledger anymore, multiple notebooks, each labeled with a family name and a wind direction. She recorded soil type, trench depth, bank angle, sump capacity, overflow route, fuel burned, floor temperature, and the date of every maintenance visit. The notebooks were not scientific publications. They were the working records of a woman who had learned that the difference between a system that worked and a system that failed was the quality of the information kept about it. Milton Ash became her surveyor. He walked new sites with his carpenter's square and his damaged hand and his professional eye for grade and angle. And he told families things about their soil and their slope that Ragna confirmed or corrected based on what Tollef had taught her. The partnership was practical. Milton understood structures. Ragna understood the air beneath them. Together they could assess a site in an afternoon and produce a design by evening. They disagreed often. Milton wanted standardized dimensions, one specification for every trench, the way a carpenter builds to a single plan. Ragna insisted that each site required its own measurements because soil changed every 50 feet and wind patterns shifted with terrain. Milton said standardization was the only way to teach the method to people who were not Ragna. Ragna said teaching people to follow a standard without understanding why was teaching them to build trenches that would fail in the first unusual season. The argument never resolved. It became a running disagreement that surfaced at every new site and was settled each time by the specific conditions of the ground. Sometimes Milton's standard worked. Sometimes Ragna's custom design was necessary, and the soil did not care which of them was right in general, as long as someone was right in particular. Vail made his move in August of 1882. He calculated that Ragna would be weakest before harvest, when the summer's expenses had drawn down her reserves and the autumn's income had not yet arrived. He was correct. Ragna had spent the summer teaching, not earning. The families she helped paid her in labor, oats, and cordwood, not in cash. Her tin behind the flour sack held $2.15. The debt note stood at $14.60, plus 8 months of interest at the rate Vail had penciled into his ledger, bringing the total to $16.40. Vail sent a letter, not a visit, a letter written in the formal language of a creditor exercising a legal right. The letter stated that the full balance was due within 30 days. If unpaid, Vail would petition the county for a lien on the Breca improvements, which included the cabin, the shed, the fencing, and he was careful to include this, the earthwork surrounding the structure. Ragna read the letter at her table. She read it twice, She set it on the ledger, which was the only surface in the cabin that held nothing else, because the ledger had become a kind of altar to measurement, and the letter was a measurement of a different kind. She did not have $16.40. She did not have a way to earn $16.40 in 30 days. The families she had helped could not pay her in cash because they did not have cash either. The frontier economy ran on barter, labor exchange, and credit was controlled by the man who held her debt. She told Milton. She told Marit. She did not ask for help. She stated the problem the way she stated trench dimensions, as a fact that required a response. The response came 17 days later on a Saturday morning when Milton Ash, Marit Lund, Deputy Wallace Pike, and 3 other families, the Freers, the Ingrams, and a family named Coulter, whose cabin Ragna had helped trench in July, arrived at Vale's store at the same time. This was not coincidence. Milton had organized it, moving from homestead to homestead over the preceding week with a piece of paper on which he had written a single number and a request. They had pooled their resources, not cash, goods, labor tallies. Cordwood measured and valued, oats weighed and priced at the current rate. Marit brought 4 jars of preserved plums and a bolt of cloth her sister had sent from Minnesota. Pike brought a promissory note for 3 days of fence work, valued at $1.50 per day. The Freers brought a calf. The Ingrams brought 12 pounds of salt pork. Milton converted everything to dollar value on the paper. The total came to $17.10, 70 cents more than Vale's demand. They walked into the store together. Vale was behind the counter, marking inventory. He looked up and saw 6 families standing in his store in a line, and he understood before anyone spoke. Milton placed the paper on the counter. He placed the goods valuation beside it. He placed the coins, $4.20 in mixed silver and copper, the only actual currency in the collection, on top of the paper. "This covers the Brecka note," Milton said. "The balance is in goods and labor at fair market value. You can verify the weights and measures." Vale looked at the paper. He looked at the coins. He looked at the faces behind Milton, Marit with her jaw set, Pike with his hat in his hands, the Freers and Ingrams standing shoulder to shoulder, and behind them, visible through the store window, the Coulter wagon with the calf tied to the tailgate. "This is not legal tender," Vale said. "It is fair payment," Milton said. "You accept goods and labor from every other account in this store. I have seen your ledger." Vale's ledger was his weapon, and Milton had just named it. Every farmer in the room knew that Vale accepted barter for credit. He could not refuse Ragna's payment in kind without refusing a practice that sustained half his business. Vale said nothing for a long time. He looked at the paper. He looked at the coins. He looked at Milton's damaged hand, resting on the counter with the 2 blackened finger stumps visible above the bandage line. "So the moat has subjects now," Vale said. Ragna was not in the store. She was at her cabin, checking the trench banks for summer settling. She did not learn about the payment until Milton rode to her claim that afternoon and told her the note was canceled. She stood at the south crossing and listened. She did not smile. She did not cry. She said, "What did he say?" "He said, the moat has subjects." Ragna looked at the trench. She looked at the willow stakes. She looked at the cabin that had been a box the wind had found, and was now a structure surrounded by a system that 12 families had replicated, and 1 storekeeper had tried to foreclose on, and 6 neighbors had defended with a calf, salt pork, and $4 in mixed coin. "No," Ragna said. "It has witnesses." Vale's humiliation did not come from the debt payment. The debt payment was a tactical defeat. Humiliation came from the winter of 1883, when Vale's own storeroom developed a problem he could not solve with conventional methods. The storeroom sat behind the main store, a frame addition with a plank floor and no foundation. Vale stored flour barrels, salt, dried goods, and lamp oil in the storeroom, and every winter the barrels along the north wall froze. The flour hardened into blocks that had to be chipped apart. The lamp oil thickened until it would not pour. The salt clumped into masses that crumbled when struck, but could not be measured by the pound until they were broken. Vale tried banking sod against the north wall. It helped the wall. It did not help the floor. The cold entered the same way it entered every cabin in Kingsbury County, under the sill, through the floor gaps, along the ground where dense air pooled and would not leave. He knew the answer. He had known the answer for 2 years. He had mocked the answer, foreclosed on the answer, and called the answer a dry moat for a queen with no kingdom. In November of 1883, Vale hired 2 men to dig a shallow trench around the north and west walls of his storeroom. Not the full 5-foot depth, not the complete perimeter, a 3-foot cut, 60 feet long, with a sump at the northwest corner. He paid the men in store credit and told them to work after the store closed so the job would be finished before anyone noticed. A child noticed. The Shields boy. The same boy who had slipped near the edge of Ragna's trench 2 winters earlier, saw the fresh earth behind Vale's store and told his mother, who told Marit, who said nothing to Vale and nothing to Ragna and nothing to anyone except her husband, who laughed for the first time in a month. The boy repeated Vale's old line at the schoolhouse. "Mr. Vale has a moat now," he said. "Maybe he thinks his flour will ride away on horseback." Vale heard the line repeated back to him within a week. He did not respond. He did not deny the trench. He did not explain it. He continued selling flour and marking ledgers and calculating the distance between people's debts and their breaking points. But the calculation had changed because the people who owed him money now had warmer floors and lower fuel costs. And warmer floors and lower fuel costs meant fewer desperate decisions. And fewer desperate decisions meant Orson Vale's particular talent was worth less than it had been. He never spoke to Ragna about the trench behind his store. She never mentioned it. The silence between them was not peace. It was the sound of a man who had lost an argument he could not admit having had, and a woman who had won a victory she did not need to claim. Thomas Keene arrived in De Smet in June of 1883, driving a freight wagon loaded with window glass and thermometers. The rail line had reopened fully for the first time since the hard winter, and goods that had been scarce for 3 years flooded into the territory. Glass was the most desired. Every cabin with oiled paper windows wanted glass, and the families who could afford it sent orders east and waited months for delivery. Thomas Keene hauled the delivery from the railhead to the settlements, 30 miles at a time, over roads that were not roads but suggestions made by wagon wheels in prairie grass. He was 36, widowed. His wife had died of typhus in Minnesota 2 years earlier, and he had the build of a man who lifted heavy things for a living and the disposition of a man who preferred objects to arguments. He spoke little. He listened carefully. He noticed things about structures and materials, the way a freight driver notices things about loads and balance, professionally, without sentiment, as a function of keeping heavy objects from breaking. He met Ragna at the break a cabin when he delivered a pane of window glass she had ordered with the first cash she earned after the debt was cleared. She had taken washing through the spring, not because Marit had suggested it, but because the trench system was established, and her labor was no longer consumed by digging and maintenance and teaching. The washing earned her enough for glass, a new stove hinge, and a tin of nails. Thomas carried the glass to the cabin and saw the trench. He set the glass against the wall, walked to the edge of the cut, and looked into it the way Milton had looked at it 2 years earlier, with the assessment of a man who understood physical systems and was encountering one he had not seen before. "What is the depth?" he asked. 5 feet on 3 sides, 4.5 on the east where the sand is loose. What does it do? Ragna told him. Not the full history, not the mockery, the debt, the mentor, the storm, the function. Cold air sinks. The trench catches it before it reaches the floor. The floor stays warmer. The stove burns less wood. Thomas looked at the trench. He looked at the plank crossings. He looked at the willow stakes with their cloth strips. He said, "The crossings are too narrow for a loaded wheelbarrow." It was not a criticism. It was an observation from a man who moved heavy things across bridges and noticed when bridges were not wide enough. Ragna looked at the crossings. She had built them for foot traffic, herself, the children, visitors. She had not considered wheelbarrows because she did not own a wheelbarrow. "I can build wider ones," Thomas said. "I have scrap planking in the wagon." He built the crossings that afternoon. He did not ask permission. He did not explain his reasoning. He measured the trench width at each crossing point, cut planks from his scrap stock, and nailed them across the span with a precision that made Milton Ash's carpentry look approximate. The new crossings were 18 inches wide, edged with a raised lip to prevent wheelbarrow wheels from rolling off, and braced from beneath with angled supports that rested on the trench bank without damaging the slope. Ragna watched him work. She corrected his slope angle on the south crossing, where his support brace pressed against the bank at too steep an angle and would have cracked the sod pinning if weight bore down on it. Thomas looked at the correction, understood it immediately, and fixed it without comment. They ate supper at her table. Thomas brought salt pork from his wagon provisions. Ragna made cornbread. The conversation was practical. Freight routes, road conditions, the price of window glass in Minnesota versus Dakota, the difference between cottonwood and oak for stove fuel. They did not discuss personal history. They did not discuss the future. They discussed materials and methods and the properties of things. And the discussion had the quality of two people discovering that they thought about the world in the same language. Thomas returned 3 weeks later with a load of supplies for Vale's store. He stopped at the Brecke cabin and repaired the leather door hinges, replacing them with iron ones he had carried from the railhead. Ragna asked what she owed him. He said the hinges were from a damaged shipment that would have been discarded. She did not believe him, but she accepted the hinges because accepting them was easier than arguing, and because the door now closed without stretching, and the draft it admitted when it opened was half what it had been. He came back in August. He came back in September. Each visit included a repair or an improvement, a shelf bracket, a window frame, a section of stovepipe that fit better than the original. Each visit included a meal. Each visit lasted longer than the one before. Marit told Ragna that the freight driver was courting her. Ragna said he was fixing her cabin. Marit said that was the same thing when a man spent his own money on another person's hinges. The courtship, if that was what it was, happened through shared labor. Thomas built a proper tool shelf in the shed. Ragna showed him how to read soil layers at a trench site for the Coulter family's second cabin. Thomas corrected her carpentry on a new plank crossing. Ragna corrected his slope angle on a drainage cut. They argued about the best way to seal a stovepipe joint. Thomas favored clay. Ragna favored a double-wall slip joint she had seen Tolev describe but never build. And the argument lasted through 3 visits and ended with Thomas building the slip joint and admitting that it sealed better than clay. They married in the spring of 1884, after Ragna completed the final improvements required to prove up her homestead claim. The claim was recorded in her name, Ragna Brecke, and the marriage did not change the title. Thomas moved on to the claim, which became the Keenbrecke farm, and the name held both of them, because Ragna would not let the claim lose the name of the man who had died building it. The years compressed. Ragna and Thomas had a daughter in 1885 and a son in 1887. Eli grew tall and quiet and developed a talent for measurement that took him to a surveyor's apprenticeship in Huron. Torbjörn taught school in De Smet, 3 miles from the cabin where she had coughed through the worst storm in Dakota memory, and her students learned arithmetic partly from textbooks and partly from a system of floor temperature measurements their teacher had performed since she was 5 years old and had never stopped. The trench system spread. By the mid-1880s, more than a dozen families around De Smet used some version of Ragna's cold sink trench, sump drainage, or wind diversion cut. Not every cabin used the full 5-foot ring. Some used the half-moon design Ragna had adapted for sheltered sites. Some used Pike's cold pocket on the windward wall only. A few used the 3-foot compromise that Tolef had argued for and Ragna had resisted, and the 3-foot versions worked well enough on sandy soil with good drainage, though Ragna never stopped believing that the full depth was the full solution. The notebooks accumulated: wind direction, soil type, trench depth, fuel consumed, floor temperature. Ragna kept them on the shelf Thomas had built in the shed, stacked by year and by family. They were not published. They were not shared beyond the community. They were the working records of a woman who had learned to measure what other people laughed at, and who kept measuring because the measurements were the only language the cold understood. She aged with one stiff shoulder from 31 days of mattock work and a habit of checking floor drafts with a thread every November. The thread was not necessary. The trench was maintained. The crossings were solid. The sump drained. The overflow channel ran clear to the swale, but she checked anyway, every year, because the thread was where it had started, a piece of string tied to a splinter, held near a floorboard gap, telling her what the wind was doing beneath her children's feet. Thomas died in 1906, kicked by a horse while loading freight at the railhead. Ragna did not remarry. She lived on the claim with the daughter and son until the daughter married and the son went to work on the railroad. She kept the stove fed. She kept the ledger updated. She kept the trench maintained. She died in 1911 on a mild October evening, sitting in the chair near the north wall. The chair had been Tolef's, the one he had sat in during his last week, when his lungs sipped air through a crack and his fingers moved down the columns of numbers in the ledger. Ragna sat in it because it was near the stove, and because the north wall was where the cold entered first, and even in mild weather, even with a trench that had worked for 30 years, she preferred to sit where she could feel the draft that was no longer there. Eli found her the next morning. The stove was cold. The ledger was on the table. The thread was tied to the splinter near the north floor gap, where it had hung for 3 decades, and it hung still. By the mid-1880s, 12 families around De Smet used some variation of Ragna Brekke's trench, sump, or wind diversion cut. Not every cabin used the full 5-foot ring. Some used partial cuts where the land dipped naturally, or cold pockets on the windward wall, or half-moon trenches adapted from Ragna's designs for sheltered sites. The key lesson spread not as a patent or a publication, but as shared knowledge passed from neighbor to neighbor, from mother to daughter, from a woman with a mattock to anyone willing to dig. Do not only feed the stove. Stop the floor from feeding the wind. Ragna Brekke lived out her life on the claim that bore her first husband's name and her second husband's labor. She kept Bernt's account ledger until the pages grew soft and the pencil marks faded, and then she kept it anyway, because the page that once held debt figures had been covered with winter readings, children's pencil marks, and Tolef Assen's soil notes, and a record like that does not stop being valuable because the ink grows thin. On a January night years after the storm that had tested the trench and broken Milton Ash's hand and sent Marit through the dark with a baby against her chest, snow streamed low across the prairie north of De Smet the way it always had and always would, horizontal, relentless, searching for gaps the way water searches for cracks. The wind found the break a cabin and ran along the ground toward the north sill. It found the trench first. It dropped into the 5-foot cut and raced around the cabin in the channel Ragna had dug with a cracked mattock candle and a piece of string, and 31 days of labor the town had called a dry moat for a queen with no kingdom. Inside, a child crossed the floor barefoot to fetch a cup from the table. The stove was low. The room was not warm because winter had become gentle. Winter had not become gentle. The room was warm because someone had listened to where the cold wanted to go and given it somewhere else to enter. The town had laughed at the hole around her cabin, but Ragna Brecka had not been digging a moat. She had been giving winter somewhere else to enter,